This is science too. And as you can see, it's very difficult to maintain our yoga. A yoga builds tapas through accumulation. And this accumulated penetration happens in a very mysterious way. Causal penetration is like taking a pin and popping a balloon. But yogic penetration is completely different from that. It's like merging the pin and the balloon together so that they simultaneously occur without there being any discontinuity between the two. In the high Dharma, a long time ago, when there was a cowboy yogi named Aryadeva, who had been trained by some very, very powerful teachers, sauntered into a town in northern India, he was asked to prepare a special discourse for the king, who would then judge whether he was going to live or die on the basis of his penetration of the Dharma. And Aryadeva asked, when he got to the court, for a glass of water. And a glass of water was brought to him. And he took out from his robe a pin, actually a little needle. The only thing that a classic monk used to carry is his robe, his bowl, his needle, to re-sew his robe every spring out of scraps. A robe that was not sewn out of scraps was a sign of not understanding the Dharma. When you see monks in beautiful robes, they do not understand the Dharma. The Buddha was very specific. There shall be no whole robes. You shall make your robes out of throwaway scraps and remake it every spring. And that's why they carried a needle. So Aryadeva took his needle out of his robe and dropped it into the glass of water. He said, "Take this to the king." And he got up and he left. That was Aryadeva's way of saying that the high Dharma can only be understood by you if you do it. There's no way for someone to teach it to you. And teachers who think they can teach it to you are not good teachers. Here's your own needle. Sew your own robe. Make your own discipline. That's as close as a teacher can take you to a high Dharma. That was about 1,600 years ago that happened. Today we face the same kind of a situation. Everyone is looking to be taught, and you can be instructed, and you can be trained, and you can be brought to certain thresholds, but no one can teach you wisdom. The sign of a good teacher is someone who, when approaching that threshold where wisdom begins to have its traction, that they step aside and let you pass by them, let you go ahead of them. And so the only effective teaching that there is at this kind of a threshold and this level is for me to get out of your way. And yet, paradoxically, the very process requires that I sit here in this saddle, on this stool, and continue. But what I'm continuing is in such a way as to allow you to pass me by, to go ahead of me, to understand more than I can say. The difficulty here, as you can appreciate, is that if you're not alert in yourself, you will pass me by daydreaming. You will pass me by fantasizing. And you will fill in with a kind of mythic imagery, a kind of a symbolic thought in place of the scientific presentation which I'm endeavoring to engender here. So I'm creating a kind of a thought bubble here, which is magical. The needle which you have, if you merge it with this particular thought bubble, the thought bubble will not break and pop and leave you without that context. But if you bring your own needle to this, you'll be able to enter into it in such a way that you will have the inside track yourself instead of me. And this is as it should be. Now, in a small vignette, the 20th century, in terms of science, has followed the wisdom trail of 1700 years ago, almost to a T. The problem 16 or 1700 years ago was with the minds that were still schooled in the imagery of the culture, in the mythology of the tribes, in the power of mythic images like the king, in the advances in power which the mind had at that time, where symbolic integration was brought to very, very high level. If you want to test yourself on high-level, sophisticated, integrative writing, take yourself to the geniuses of 1700 years ago. Take yourselves to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Take yourself to the Aeneids of Plotinus. Take yourself to the high Dharma Shunyata commentaries of Nagarjuna. And you'll find there plenty of wit to grind your brain upon. They had no trouble whatsoever with sophisticated integration that would almost stymie anyone alive today. But the difficulty then, which we find today, and we have to deal with today, which they could defer then, is that the Alice in Wonderland realm of the differential universe could then be put on hold, and today it cannot. We face a situation today which 1700 years ago could be set aside. Today we cannot set it aside because it includes our lives. And if we set it aside, we die. 1700 years ago, nature was still enough in control on this planet that one could let the few individuals, the few instances of penetration into differential consciousness, let it factor back into nature. It didn't make much of a difference. Today, the interwoven roots and growth and fractalization of man's partial consciousness has so changed nature that nature will never go back to the way it was on this planet. If left untended, the contaminated nature now will kill all life on it. No question whatsoever. It's a time bomb which has about 30 years to run. If we don't clean up and reform what we have, the nature on this planet now is contaminated enough to kill life. You don't need a World War III. You don't need any kind of asteroid hitting the planet. You don't even need increased stupidity and challenge. It's there already. So we cannot, like 1700 years ago, just let nature take care of the rest. We have to now realize that we have the responsibility to deal with it. An education like this is meant to engender the phase form maturation, which allows us to handle this situation and to handle it, in fact, with elegance and ease. I want to bring in a quotation to start science too. All this is a preamble. Now we come to the generative point of science 2, the generative seed out of which this lecture grows. If I were to write it, and I did, I wrote it down in the notes for Science 2. The title of the lecture is Feynman and Mary Leakey, taken from the two individuals who were like the pair. Their books, Feynman's QED, Quantum Electrodynamics, and Mary Leakey's Discovering the Past, her autobiography in paleontology, are the pair of characteristic books, the pairing which allows for some kind of a electromagnetic and hopefully a magnetoelectric wholeness to happen. A wholeness which the physicist David Bohm described one time in one of his books. He uses a title for one of his books, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. That there's an implicate order, not explicitly there, but implicate within the wholeness. That order has a timeless quality. One of the first instances of that wholeness coming into manifestation was in the China of about 2,500 years ago. 2,500 years ago, Lao Tzu in China looked at the maturation of the I Ching application and its mysterious depths and came out with a characterization that had as its pair Tao and Te. Tao as the 0, Te as the 1. And with that binary base of 0 and 1, that binary language of 0 and 1, Lao Tzu discovered that one could speak, one could use a language to characterize all reality. Just as today, 0 and 1 make a binary language which all computers use. No matter what language is being used, 0 and 1 is the symbolic structure which allows for that to take place, for the manifestation to have objectivity. So profound was the Tai Chi symbol that Niels Bohr, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, put it on a family crest, his own. So here's a Danish physicist in the 20th century putting Lao Tzu's Tai Chi symbol on his family crest. And out of this, Bohr developed, here's the Centennial Conference 1985, recent developments in quantum field theory, just 12 years ago. But when Bohr developed his ability to see wholeness in terms of the implicate order, the Tai Chi was a visionary. It's like this visionary projection, this talismanic use of the Tai Chi symbol. That Tai Chi symbol, when visualized, was a picture in his mind. And as long as it remained a picture in his mind, it was a symbol, but its function was that of an amulet. Its function was to protect meaning by sealing it into an integral form, the symbol in the mind. 1,700 years ago, sophisticated minds like Plotinus and Patanjali and Nagarjuna understood that symbols in the mind are never talismanic. They are always integrals. They always integrate. They always bring together. They never release into an emission of increasing infinity. And that's why infinity does not occur in nature. 0 does not occur in nature. Technically, they're not there. One could take nature as a whole in God's hands, and to paraphrase Buckaroo Banzai, one could pound this into microscopic metaphysical dust and sift through it forever, and you would never find a zero or an infinite. They're not there. Where they occur is in a talismanic use of the symbol in a differential mode, so that the mind gives itself over to envisioning consciousness. And this consciousness then has the ability to take a symbol which initially was in the mind and put it through a distillation process, put it through a transformational process, so that it now operates in a completely different ecology. And this ecology, because it's unnatural, because it's not natural, because it's supernatural, because it's, I use an old Sanskrit term, because it's parayana. It's the way beyond. It's not even a Mahayana compared to a Hinayana, which is the way they talked 1700 years ago. It's not a great universal vehicle so much, though 1700 years ago it certainly seemed like that. The image that was used by Aryadeva in one of his talks was that the Mahayana was like the full moon, and that the old way, the Hinayana, was like some kind of little star, and that the Mahayana was much more capable for use than just this little star. It was like the full moon. But eventually, that whole development became powered up, so it became what was called the Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, which was like the sun. So that the difference was between a star, the full moon, and then the sun. Our time replaces the sun by something called the Big Bang, where the entire universe explodes in an unbelievable, unimaginable, not imageable actual occurrence, which, when it opens itself out in this conscious, talismanic, projective way, becomes the cosmos as we see it. As Carl Sagan used to say, billions and billions of galactic clusters, each having hundreds of millions of stars, so that one literally has trillions, if not quadrillions, of star systems in every direction, as far as you can see. Our concern in science is to address as real that scale and that scope. It's as simple as that, and yet there is a broken gear that's in the way that forbids that of happening for real, and only allows it to happen in an imaginary surrogate. And so that we live on a very poorly designed stage set. And we are trying to complete a very badly written play with untrained actors on a very badly designed stage set. And meanwhile, there's a forest fire outside the theater. What the forest fire is an illusion of massive ignorance that infects us like this is a mixed metaphor, like a plague. All right, let's come back again. Let's try and begin science too. Let's come back to a quotation that I have here. A quotation in a book which has the same title as one of our texts, QED. This book is entitled QED and the Men Who Made It. And there's a big chapter on Feynman in here. And in the chapter 8 on Feynman, there are over 200 notes, and this is note number 153. It's a quotation from a letter by an English physicist whose name was Dirac, Paul Dirac. His initials are P-A-M, Pam, Paul Dirac. This is from one of his letters in 1930 about the problem of trying to visualize the quantum mechanical cosmos. Here's what Dirac wrote 67 years ago. In other words, there was already a population of human beings 67 years ago, 2/3 of a century ago, who got it that this was the state of the conundrum that they were facing. The classic tradition has been to consider the world to be an association of observable objects, particles, fluids, and so forth, moving about according to definite laws of force, so that one could form a mental picture in space and time of the whole scheme, the big picture. This led to a physics whose aim was to make assumptions about the mechanism and forces connecting these observable objects, to account for their behavior in the simplest possible way. It has become increasingly evident in recent times, however, that nature works on a different plan. Notice, not only does consciousness not work this way, but in fact, nature doesn't work that way either. Her fundamental laws do not govern the world as it appears in our mental pictures in any direct way. Let's come back to that one more time. Not only does consciousness, in a differential mode, not work this particular way, but nature in fact herself does not work in this particular way. The only realm where this works in this particular way is in the mind. Why? Remember that the mind, in order to secure its phase of objectivity, in doing so, abstracts itself from the world. Abstracts itself from the very real mystery of nature in order to make it logically clear within the mind. Nature is never logically clear. You're a very poor researcher in science if you think that nature is logically clear. Mental processes need to be logically clear. Symbol systems need to be logically clear. But one of the great virtues of a logically clear symbolic system is that it recognizes that it has a bug list. It has stuff that's wrong with the operation, the operatives, and the operator. All three, and that there's a point of diminishing returns for complete systematic logical ecologies. One of my major professors when I was a teenager, I entered the University of Wisconsin at 17, and one of our professors, Julius Weinberg, who had written a classic book on the examination of logical positivism. He had written it in the 30s when he was 20 years old. I had him when he was in his late 50s, and he used to take his tortoiseshell glasses off, his short reddish hair, his long gray suits impeccably pressed, and he would suck on one end of his glasses, and he would address speakers that were brought in to lecture us from England, from France, from Japan, from the United States, world-class philosophers speaking on logic, and he would grill them after they had delivered these beautiful, insightful lectures on philosophy and logic that almost no one could follow. And he would point out classically that in order to have an airtight logical system that was really airtight, the wrench that made it airtight was an auxiliary system that defined the axiomatic basis of the first system in terms that were abstracted from it. That's the only way that you can get something logically airtight, which means that at minimum you have a pair of systems. And the axiomatic system is always abstractly different from the operative system. Usually what people mean when they say that something needs to be logical is they mean that it has to be mythological. That it has to follow this sequence. Here is your premise. Here are the predicates. Here's your conclusion. The shape of the Aristotelian syllogism is a mythic structure. That's what his teacher was trying to tell him all the time. Aristotle's teacher was Plato for 20 years. It may be unfortunate that Plato died after Aristotle studied for 20 years. Maybe in the 21st year he would have gotten it. Plato uses mythic structures in his dialogues to set up provisional spaces wherein the old thought can collect itself and swirl around long enough to show you that it doesn't go any further. That these mythic structures, these mythic image-based movements of mind are grand, they're convincing, they're ever so much reverenced, and they go just so far and no further. They do not transform. They never transform. It's against their laws of structure to transform. A good myth has within its play all kinds of modulation. Mythic structures always modulate. There are always variations, but the variations are on ways to tell that particular story. The story never changes. Whereas a story that changes, a story that has a transformation in it, the transformation always comes near the very end. And when you have a mythic structure that has a transformation near the very end, the myth changes and becomes a fairy tale. And the fairy tale is about magic, not about myth. A fairy tale is about some conscious discovery of something new that was never there before, that's completely different, and when factored back in, changes the entire nature of what one had understood was possible. When you introduce the dimension of consciousness into time and space, even time-space, it changes, and it becomes full of possibility. It becomes full of infinite possibility. So that one now has to talk about not the way the story should read, or the way the story should be told, or the way which this scenario sequence should turn out, but one has to talk about possibilities that hopefully we're going to be within the range that something like this could probably occur. But that definitely we have to keep in reserve the possibility every single time that it might not. That's called maturation. That's called being realistic in a conscious time-space. Whereas the expectation of a logical cookie cutter that can be stamped permanently, indefinitely, so that things work out exactly that way, is the very image of a mythic tyrant. Like a King Midas, who everything he touches turns to gold. And he happens to hug his daughter and she turns to gold. It's just a lump of gold. One has to be very circumspect about the black magic use of logic. Whereas one of the biggest curses of the last 300 years has been the absolute domination by a clerically structured minority using this tyranny, this bullwhip of the logical expectations over populations of people who are trying to live and play and love with life in some kind of full way. And you are told constantly by hierarchically placed logical monitors that you're not making sense. Well, even as long ago as about 130 years ago, Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland about the logical conundrums that are there in logic itself. Because on the other side of the mind that insists that everything is just this way because that's the right order, that's the way the mind has figured it out. What is in Alien, Sigourney Weaver says to Tom Skerritt, "Why are you letting them do this?" He said, "That's the way the company wants it." She says, "Why?" He says, "Because someone figured it out that way. You do what the company tells you." A little vignette of the junk. Here's Dirac again. Go back. The classical tradition has been to consider the world to be an association of observable objects moving about according to definite laws of force, causal force, authority force, so that one could form a mental picture in space, in time, of the whole scheme. This is the way it should be. This is the way you should be. This is what you should do. With that kind of a finger. I got the right finger, have I? This led to a physics whose aim was to make assumptions about the mechanism and forces connecting these observable objects to account for their behavior. Notice the language, to account for their behavior. Yeah, those atoms have got to behave. Those molecules better behave. Do you get it? And because they're not behaving the way the mental picture is, man comes in with his big-time industrial whip and says to Mother Nature, "Get in shape. You've got mountains here where there should be a parking lot. How dare you? You don't have enough of these kinds of polymers, which we need in the metal ore, so we're going to put them in." CFCs don't work with the natural ecology? Well, then nature will have to learn to take it and like it. Oh, well, there's a hole in the ozone layer because of using CFCs. Well, excuse me, we'll just find a way to fix that. Nature will learn to behave. It's this kind of arrogance that's the Frankenstein. Not the ugly guy who goes after the kitties with the outstretched hands, but this kind of crap. That's the scientific word for it. My word, junk. You can put a QUE on the end, but it's still junk. Here's Dirac again. It has become increasingly evident in recent times, this is 1930, however, that nature works on a different plan. Her fundamental laws do not govern the world as it appears in our mental picture in any direct way, but instead, they control a substratum of which we cannot form a mental picture without introducing irrelevancies. That is to say that if you get a mental picture, you can count on the fact that you're duping yourself. How? That you're still working on a mythic horizon and you're still utilizing the integrative, abstracting, symbolic capacity of the mind, and you're not envisioning possibility. And one of the most formative objects that occurs only in the free glow of envisioning possibilities is your spiritual person. Let's say it really clear. Your spiritual person does not occur on the mythic level. There's no variant of a myth that includes you as a spiritually objective, differential, conscious individual. You can fit into the role of an Oedipus or an Electra. You can become an Apollo or you can become an Aphrodite. But you can't become a Chloe or a Greg or a Thorsten. Much less the Chloe, the Greg, the Thorsten, who one could get to know. We mentioned once, a long time ago, that if you put an array of machinery that allows you to see the entire electromagnetic spectrum, Jacob Bernowski did this in The Ascent of Man in one of his segments. Here is this machinery that allows us to see the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The only place on the whole spectrum that you can see a human face is with the visible light. The only machinery you need is the human eye. The human eye is made to focus character. The human eye is specifically made through billions of years of evolution to see who it is. So that one could look eye to eye with another spiritual person, and you could see reflected in the pupil of their eyes your face. And you would know that they could see reflected in the pupils of your eyes their face. That's where the phrase seeing eye to eye comes from. It means a pair of spiritually objective, differentially conscious persons looking at each other can learn to see themselves in the other. That there's that kind of synergy, that kind of accuracy, and there is no way that that is an identity. That's called a complementarity, and that's what Niels Bohr called it. He said the principle of the way in which nature works is with a complementarity. That's what the Tai Chi symbolizes, a complementarity. That the two working together work in such a way that the essential part of the one is in the other. The operative essential of you is in the other. That's why cooperation usually is spelled with golden letters. It means that the only way the operative is going to continue is that that pair operates together as a whole. The implicate order is of a pairedness in wholeness. That's how it works. That's called being practical, being hard-nosed, being realistic. That is how it works. To have everyone lined up in some kind of authoritative cloning is a dead end. To finish the Dirac quote, we cannot form a mental picture without introducing irrelevancies. The formulation of these laws requires the use of the mathematics of transformations. The important things in the world appear as the invariants, or the nearly invariants, with simple transformation properties, of these transformations, so that what becomes real in consciousness are the transformative gestalts that are ongoing. They not only happen past tense, but they realistically are happening present perfect tense. So that it's ongoing. So that by the time you get to a spiritually objective person who's real in a differential conscious vision, and that has played itself out into a differential process known as history, the objective cosmos that occurs in a kind of differentially aligned quality of spiritual persons. That's why the conviction has always been there that God is real. Not the God of the graven image. It's not the shape that the gold takes at all. Those mental icons are dead ends. They are closed, illogically abstracted death seeds. They lead to death. They always lead to death. They have to. Whereas fertile seeds always lead to life. One has a very clear choice. You have a choice between life and death. Choose life. But the life, the things we are immediately aware of are the relations, the relationalities of these nearly invariants to a certain frame of reference, usually one chosen to introduce special simplifying features which are unimportant from the point of view of general theory. So that even understanding this about graven images, even understanding this about abstraction, even understanding this about complementarity, there is a major snag at the end of this whole development, which is built in like some kind of universal riddle to science. And when we come back from the break, we'll see that science has an even more monstrous problem within it. A problem that has not been surmounted at all, and which is characterized by the development of the atomic bomb. And recharacterized by the development and dead end of the space program. The atomic bomb and the space program have slid back regressively into mythic stories that played themselves out thousands of years ago and are running rampant over our lives today because there's no one there to say no. Or there wasn't. The peculiar thing about ignorance is that it only takes one person to wake up. An imaginary, logically tight, abstracted illusion cannot take place if there's even one person who's awake. It shorts it out. Which is why the devil likes closed, logically complete systems, because that's the only way to keep the show going. One smile in hell ruins the whole show. Let's take a break. Let's come right back here to where we left off. Let's use our remembering here. And notice that if we remember exclusively in terms of images, we're setting traps for ourselves. One of the really difficult qualities that a conscious spiritual person practices is remembering without images. That it seems at first that it's an impossibility How do you remember if you don't make pictures? If you don't make those images? And then when they accomplish that, when the person matures enough to be able to start to remember without images, then you have to tell them the bad news, that you have to remember without ideas also. Then that separates not only the sheep from the goats, but the aardvarks from the rhinoceroses. It also shows that an artist who is developing, let's say, a novel, or an artist who's developing a film, or an artist who's developing a painting, how do they work? How do they proceed? Their stock and trade are images. Their stock and trade very frequently are ideas. At least one really great synthesizing symbolic idea. How do you proceed? How can it happen? How can there be such a thing then as a conscious artist? How can an artist tell a story? He has to have images. He has to have those mythic sequences. What's going on here? And these kinds of impossibilities are just the beginning. They're just for openers. It becomes more severe the more that one comes to understand what we're up against. We're up against a stacked deck in which the stacking of the deck happens every time someone deals. It's almost impossible to get an idea of. And yet, when you get a good idea of it, the idea lures you into a fatal flaw of needing to come back to that idea to confirm what your understanding was, because it's the idea in the first place that was the demon in the works, the fly in the ointment. So by the time we get to science, we get into one of these conundrums that great artists experience, but great scientists also experience. And it takes a very peculiar type of play for someone to learn to hike in Cezanne forests and not just the Sierra Nevada. It takes a very peculiar distillation of truthfulness to be at home in Ma Yuan distances and not just the perspectives of Sebastiano Cerullo. It takes a very peculiar freedom to be able to journey in Van Vogt complexities and not always be in some kind of Orpheus mythology or Eurydice mythology. So all of the problems of civilization turn out to be intractable, and intractable over a convergent snare that becomes at last conspicuous when science reaches its culmination. So it's as if the myth was right. The myth is that the original myth of science was the Greek Icarus, who wanted to fly like the birds, and so he made mechanical wings out of struts and wax. And because he was successful, because he could fly, he flew so high, he flew too close to the sun, and the sun melted his wings, and he crashed to his death. It's the myth of science. reformulated in a much more sophisticated conscious way by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. That as soon as man gets to the capacity where he could transform himself into a super being, he will always have a flaw that makes the superness malign. It's the same thing in genetics. Any genome that has a mutation that causes a quantum jump in superiority of that particular species, the gene is infertile. One turns out to be, I think the most apt image that we have is that of a mule. It's good for one time only and is infertile. In fact, in his great Foundation series of future history, Isaac Asimov showed the power of this secret foundation that was posited at one end of the universe to reinstate man from a historic fall that would last at least 30,000 years but could be truncated by the foundation to just 1,000 years. And Asimov showed a great understanding in showing that one foundation would not be enough, that you would have to minimally have two foundations, a second foundation completely hidden from the first, whose only responsibility was to watch out for the success of the first. Because Asimov was a very good logician. He knew enough to know the limits of logic. But he also was brilliant enough to posit that there was a third force, an unknown, a superman. So that in the Foundation series, there's this super being called the mule because he was infertile, could never reproduce, but as long as he was alive, he was unbeatable because he had more capacities than anyone had ever had. And he could manipulate without you knowing that he could manipulate. The Frankenstein of Mary Shelley, the mule of Asimov, the Icarus of mythology, are what we would call paradigm. Now we call them paradigm. A paradigm is a frame of reference. It's a shape of an ecology of an idea in its full scope. It was made very famous in the 1940s, 1950s, and especially in the early 1960s by a philosopher at the University of Chicago, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book on the way in which paradigms shift, which scientific revolutions happen because of paradigm shifts. The fly in the ointment at that time was there was almost no understanding that paradigms are made by someone. Not only are they made by someone, like a Newton, but that paradigm has the personal characteristics of the maker in there. The paradigm shift of Sir Isaac Newton, so that one had Newtonian physics instead of the medieval physics that came before him, so that one now had the laws of thermodynamics. Newton called the movements, the transformative movements in his mathematics, he called them fluxions. We call them today, when we look at the mathematical characterization of them, differential equations and integral equations. We call that whole mathematic calculus. Newton called them fluxions. Because Newton was still, in the old alchemical tradition, he was still a secret alchemist. He was a closet alchemist. He was convinced. And so the Newtonian universe, though it seems on the surface to be logically tight and mechanistically accurate and in rather local areas of the universe, it certainly is. It's very true. It's exactly true. But it happens to be exactly true only to the extent that the abstract idea is able to extend itself in space and time, and the power of doing that is rather local, extends to many dozens of planetary systems, many, many extents, almost like on a galactic or even intergalactic range. But when one gets further than that in space and time, the power of the conscious projection doesn't quite hold. And in fact, when one gets to cosmological spaces, cosmological times, it doesn't hold at all. It is what it really is. It's simply local weather. It's a special case and not the truth. But all of the impress of the Newtonian paradigm completely crushed the society of that time. The very end of the 17th century, the very beginning of the 18th century, is a time when the old was just simply crushed and thrown away. It's really a 17th century activity. There was a woman whose name, Marjorie Hope Nicholson, wrote a series of books about the impress of Newtonian physics on poetry in the early 18th century. One of her books is entitled The Breaking of the Circle. But the whole understanding of the integrity of people belonging in nature was just simply crumpled and thrown away. Another one of her books is entitled Newton Demands the Muse, the influence of his optics upon visionary poetry of the 18th century. Where in the 17th century, you would have English poets who could be metaphysical, almost mystical. They're in fact called the metaphysicals. Vaughan and Crashaw and George Herbert and Marvell and so forth. All of a sudden in the 18th century, you have something completely different. You have Wordsworth and Coleridge who suddenly are not metaphysical because they realize that that metaphysical mystery is very precarious, and out of them comes a naturalism that tends, in order to survive, to become romantic. That the only chance that man has is that one has to have this capacity to be a romantic hero in the face of this relentless accuracy which seems to control everything. And so that one gets this kind of Shelleyan hero, like a Prometheus reborn, the original Alien Resurrection. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, where his capacity, the romantic hero's capacity to deal with an ironclad authority of hierarchical universal laws that cannot be logically abrogated, he recreates himself second by second, picosecond by picosecond, as he adventures out of it. One of the great presentations of that particular journey, that freeing of consciousness from that tyranny, is Jean-Luc Godard's film Alphaville, where the detective goes into this massive super city to get the girl and take her out. She's the daughter of the maker of the super city. Or The film of H.G. Wells' Things to Come, made in 1936, where the complete logical inculcation of a Newtonian universe finally comes to a point where creativity must leave that, the artist must leave that, the scientist must leave that behind in order to find something new, in order to go into the beyond, in order to reinstate themselves. And yet, it's exactly that journey, that freeing, that necessary transformation that is the place, the threshold where the regression becomes inevitable. Without this education, without this sequencing, there's no way to even formulate, because any idea that one would have about it would be an abstracted fiction, and is an abstracted fiction. Perfectly true, perfectly logical, as long as someone is thinking it and someone can explain it exactly, and they do all the time. And it sounds good because it has all the mythic language in place. It has all the symbolic integrations all lined up. It's the greatest con job that one ever heard. They talk about beautiful worlds of humane values and nature and the whole thing, and it's all completely abstractly nonsense. It has no fertility whatsoever. Never will happen. It's like buying the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's curious because the Brooklyn Bridge at one end of Long Island is exactly polar opposite of the other end of Long Island, where Whitman used to stand at Montauk Point and look out into the stormy Atlantic and think about the cosmoses of a new future that would take a new kind of humanity, that men and women were going to be completely different from what they had been. Because it isn't just that there's a Newtonian paradigm shift, but there's also other paradigm shifts that were happening. Whitman was looking from Montauk Point before Einstein, but he was enough of an artist that he already got it. He already understood it. Because there were American thinkers who, before Einstein, a couple generations before Einstein, already understood the absurdity of trusting logically sound systems for reality. One of the greatest of them was a man named Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce's writings only in the last 20, 25 years have been unearthed after 100 years of being largely ignored, and now giant. Peirce's father was the greatest mathematician in the United States of his time. He wrote a beautiful book, I'll bring it next week. Beautiful book published in the 19th century on the Newtonian mathematical universe and some of the difficulties that are there. When Thomas Kuhn wrote his book on paradigm shifts in revolutions of science, scientific revolutions, which since the 1960s have become the jargon of con men and con women, salespeople for various pseudo-visions that populate the planet like carpetbaggers. One can hardly believe the junkyard that is out there, a tapestry of stupidity, ears deep. What was it? You needed wings to fly above the junk. That's how Coppola put it in one of his screenplays. The lies got so deep in Vietnam that you had to have wings to fly above it. It was an apocalypse now. The problem is not that these con people are so good. You can train someone in an hour to see through that kind of propaganda, and they never again will be susceptible. The problem is that the way in which reality functions, one is always going to come up against that regressive threshold, because as soon as science comes into play, what goes out of the square of attention is the mind. Symbols go out of play. To the extent that science comes into play, the symbols goes out of play. And it's only when you're formulating in a kind of a mathematic of the real, and one sees in this square of attention that at any one time one is only able to keep track of 4 phases at a time. And as science comes into play, symbols goes into subconscious. It's still there, still operative, but it's no longer amenable to conscious control. It becomes then a part of the subconscious, I hate to say unconscious, because that's a real misnomer. That's an idea that's very flawed. There's no such thing as an unconscious. One of my favorite letters by Carl Jung is to a fellow psychiatrist in 1942, where Jung writes about trying to psychoanalyze Chinese patients, and he found that they didn't have an unconscious. So it's not so universal. Well, if it's not universal, then what's going on? It's an idea that the European psyche has in its local weather and has no universality whatsoever. And that's just talking about this planet. When one is talking about other planets and other star systems, there's no such thing as an unconscious there either. But there is such a thing as a subconscious that's out of the square of attention, and you can bet that any kinds of conscious entities in the cosmos have run across and are running across this same problem all the time. Have to deal with it. The problem is that when one has an idea that is so workable that it's the theme of the very historical navigation that one is using as a conscious person in terms of one's vision, it was not only the tiller, it was the ship itself. But when you come into having science be the objectivity of the symbols has to go out of the picture. And so along with the objectivity of the person, of art, one now has a new objectivity, the cosmos, coming into play. And to that extent, the objectivity of the mind goes out of play, goes out of the picture, goes out of the square of attention. So that the person whose very objectivity has always from the get-go been based upon a confidence that it has a synergy with the objectivity of the mind has to let go of that and trust that one can turn around and have an objective synergy with the cosmos. That will be there, that is there. It's like turning from your idea of God to God. That you don't have any chance whatsoever to hold on to both. One of them has to be let go of. And it's very courageous, to say the least, to let go of your favorite idea of reality, of your favorite idea of truth, of your favorite idea that was the very bedrock upon which your objectivity as a person was even made. Not just formulated, but actually made. That's how you got to be who you are. And now you're asking yourself to do a pirouette. This was such an astounding procedure that in Plato's time, he coined a word in Greek for that pirouette, called it metanoia. It means turning around within yourself. A metanoia is a conscious transformation whereby you let go of the mind and its mythic language for good, and you turn and open yourself to the cosmos and its mysterious, magical, unknown probability of who knows what. You have to embrace, you have to become a lover of the unknown possibilities of the cosmos. That's your new mate. That's where your trust needs to be. And what makes it doubly precarious is that between the mind and the person, between symbols and art, you had conscious vision as the process of interface. Difficult enough though it was, you learned to deal with that. Now the interface between the person, between art and science, is history. And if you didn't handle history at all, there's no way that you can let it be the arbiter of your sense of realistic synergy. You can't do it. Or if you do it, you let yourself go in such a way that naively you cross your fingers and hope that the historical process is going to do it, but of course it's been mishandled all the way. And whatever confusions, whatever whirlpools are left in the historical process quickly suck you back into a regressive mode. And if you didn't form your person with really great artistry, whatever flaws are there are amenable to that regressive thing, and it picks up steam. And if your vision wasn't truthful in the first place, completely, whatever was flawed there just adds to it, and it's like a steamroller. And by the time it comes back to the mind, desperate for certainty, the mind, which was not very well trained in the first place, receives all of this desperation as like an apocalyptic fever, which it desperately seeks to find some objectivity that it can count on itself. And the major number one through 1 million, it's the same object every single time as the body. The mind says, at least I've got this. All the way back on the ritual level. So that the net that catches regression is the body. Almost every single time. And if not the body, some kind of idea of the body. When I get into shape, I'll be okay. And so people go to the gym as if they're going to church. Because we're going to get back into health. Not that way. That's a dead end. It doesn't sound like it. It can't possibly be, and yet it is a dead end. If it's so that science has this built-in precariousness that almost always ends in regression, if artists need images in order to tell their stories, how does any of this happen? If it's so impossible, if it's structurally impossible, how is it that there is art? There are Cézanne forests. Ma Yuan did paint those landscapes with one corner of a terrace looking out into infinite distances and mountain peaks that are like mystical razors raised in some surrealistic distance. How did Van Gogh do all those complexities in his plots and have somebody come out as a super mature human protagonist? How does that happen? It happens because there's a possibility. You have to understand that in a cosmos of differential reality, there's always a possibility. And even though it's only one possibility, nevertheless, it still exists as a possibility. It couldn't be closed off. The possibility is that one can run back through the ecology. One can take science and run it back through nature. What was one of the Sierra Club's original quotations they took from Thoreau John Muir, when he formed the Sierra Club in San Francisco, remembered a night that he had spent in the Sierras with Emerson. He said in one of his books it was the loneliest night he'd ever spent in his life, because here he was, he had a chance to be out in the wilderness of the Sierra Nevada in the 1880s with Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he wanted to sit out under the stars with Emerson. But Emerson's entourage said he's too old. He'll catch his death of cold. He has to stay in the tent. He has to stay warm, muffled up. And so there's the old Emerson, muffled in his tent by his keepers. And there's Muir standing out there in Crescent Meadow alone under the stars with the inspirational genius behind his whole need to be in this kind of natural openness. And he coined a phrase. He said, "In wilderness is the preservation of man." That conscious man, scientific man, has to learn to step back into nature in its wilderness capacity all over again, because that keeps the infinite ecology alive and lets you go back through, so that you go back into nature from science, from conscious objectivity, from a cosmic objectivity. And one comes back into nature in such a way that that nature, and nature being mysterious, allows for this. She apparently goes for that. She accepts us in that way and allows us to come out on the ritual level from that kind of superinfused nature, so that the rituals are a little different. They're not just primitive, but now the natures look primitive, but instead they're primordial. Instead of being naive, they're well informed and together. Instead of just being lucky in their coordination, they're now athletic. So that the rituals of someone who's come out of a conscious cosmos look primitive, but they're primordial. There's a slight difference. So that the language, the mythic language that comes out from such primordiality, has a fullness and a tension and a sparkle, a scintillation to it, that allows you to tell fantastic variants of the myth. Instead of just Orpheus, one now tells Black Orpheus, like in the film. It's not set in Greece at all. It's set in Rio de Janeiro. There were never any classical Greeks in Rio de Janeiro that we know of. There were no flights, at least. I know that. One of the peculiarities, then, of art is that art doesn't present its productions exclusively in art, but goes into this whole ecology of history and the cosmos and nature and ritual in a new way, and comes back out on the high side. And those myths, that mythic language, that's somewhat different because it's based on primordiality, not primitiveness. Because the myths now are scintillating versions of it. When they're interiorized, the new mind has a fantastic character to it. It's true that the conscious substratum in that new mind is completely subconscious. Nevertheless, it's still there. It's still operative. So that the mind that is formed out of that scintillating mythology, based on that primordial ritual that comes out of that cosmologically infused nature, that kind of mind is spectacular. And the visions that come out of that kind of mind make the whole universe jump. All the stars sing together. That's the way that the teacher of righteousness wrote it 2,200 years ago. Because God tells Job that there is a time in reality when there is so much joy in the divine love that all the stars sing together. Job's eyes are like saucers. He never knew. He thought that it was an issue of his suffering when he was innocent. And it wasn't that at all. It was that was a bind that was inevitable that he had to accept, even though it was inevitable, and his acceptance gave him a momentum to go back through and come back again. That's the way that universes get reborn, through spiritual persons, and become the cosmos. Every single star has its own tune, has its own pitch, because the elements themselves record in such a way that their light carries the melody and the rhythm of their particular songs. The science that we have by late 1997 can hear those star songs so accurately that you could give to quite a large population of astronomers now and astrophysicists, you could give them a spectrograph of a certain starlight and they could recognize and tell you what star that is. We've never seen that star in terms of a natural existential entity. No one's ever gone 300 million light years and looked at this star that only has letters and numbers, and yet the light from that star carries its entire reality. In physics, it's called the principle of the soliton. If you have a bell, and you ring that bell, the sound waves of that bell are bell-shaped. They always are. So that when you receive them in such an accurate way that you have the sound complete, you can reconstruct that it came from a bell, or exactly the shape of it. You can reconstruct it. Because one deals in differential consciousness very elegantly with particles. That's all you need are particles. All that Mary Leakey ever had were particles. Mary and Louis Leakey had little bits of teeth, little fragments of bone, and they put back together by running it back through, not backwards in a regression, but all the way through the whole ecology. Their science took these little bits that were indistinguishable from bits of rock to most people, to everyone except them. At one time in the world, there were only two people, just that married couple, who could look at bits of African turf and see that this once belonged to a human bone, but a kind of human that hasn't been around for a couple of million years. Nevertheless, that was real. And they were able to run that forward back through a kind of a nature that made room for man being not just 6,000 years old since Adam, but that Adam had ancestors 3 or 4 million years ago. And that they walked with great dignity and humanity across the land of Africa. Mary Leakey herself found the most incredible series of footprints at Lake Tole in the clay that had been covered by volcanic ash. It was a volcanic eruption several million years ago. And a woman was walking fast with her child across the landscape to get away. And they did. They got away. But their footprints in the wet riverbank were covered by hot volcanic ash and frozen for several million years until erosion bared them. And someone like a Mary Leakey was there to see that and read that. And she understood that even several million years ago, our ancestors were humane enough to take care of their young and love them in times of desperation. That they were not primitive even then. Man was primordial, but not primitive even then. And this seems to stretch the Victorian imagination so much that they couldn't believe it. Whereas today, our idea of primordiality is that there might be beings on other planets and other star systems several billion years ago, not just million, quite easily. It's quite credible. it's quite true. It's quite real. So with that kind of dimension, one sees that as one runs the psychology of the education forward several times, that each time it ratchets itself up, not just with a paradigm shift, but with a shift that doesn't even have a name anymore, because one just doesn't know what to call that. The teacher of righteousness 2,200 years ago called it Jacob's ladder. He said, man, challenged by crisis, undergoes a spiritual change where he steps up rung by rung, Jacob's ladder, which leads from earth to heaven. William Blake did a beautiful visionary painting one time, watercolor, called Jacob's Ladder. And sure enough, the ladder is not a straight ladder like a painter's ladder, like a construction ladder, but the ladder is a great DNA swirling helix that goes up that way. And it's not just some narrow thing with just one lone genius going up, but that there's a whole continuous stream of blessed beings, men and women and children, who are able to go that way. And that in this whole ecology, there are swirls that come from heaven back down to earth. Or one needs to be plural about it, of the heavens back down to the earths, because it doesn't just happen in one particular spot, but wherever it chooses to happen. So that the possible is real wherever it is possible. And one of the most intelligent things that we can do is to create possibilities for reality and truth. And as we do so, then the seemingly improbable possibilities have an opportunity to happen. This is one thing that ancient men and women learned about wisdom. You make the spaces for the miracles to happen. You cannot make the miracles, but you can invite them to happen by making the spaces. Even such a thing as on the high holidays in Judaism, one sets a special empty place, sets a plate for the stranger who might come. One creates a space, one creates an openness. And the existential family, in the mythic structure, in the symbolic shape, for some kind of visionary, impossible yet quite probable occurrence. It's this kind of wisdom that an education like this seeks to invite you to engender. I can't give it to you, but you can certainly cooperate with what I'm doing, and on your own, you all have the capacity to do it. None of you do not. All of you do. You wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have found this. You wouldn't be doing this if you didn't already have this capacity. If you didn't, you wouldn't hear anything at all. You can play a tape of this lecture for your smartest friend. They won't hear a thing unless they too have this capacity that's there. How does this capacity come? Because it's a spiritual openness that somehow got factored in a fertile way into you. It happens regardless of whatever sociological niches one could devise. Not just race, religion, gender, and so forth. One could make a telephone book of specifications. That whole telephone book does not take into consideration the very special quality that's here. It's a kind of a courageous quality that only happens at a crisis where one comes to a do or die situation and you just do. You didn't have an idea about why you're going to do it or an image that you were going to be successful, but nevertheless you stepped forward. And it's taking that step that made that path real. It doesn't matter which way you took that step, or what reason, or what image, or what idea. All of that turns out to be at that moment irrelevant. What is relevant is only that it happened. and only that you, as your artistic, spiritual, objective person, took that step in history, then that history actually leads to that heaven which is now objective, which is now there. The proviso is that you do not mistake an idea of that cosmos for the cosmos. You can't carry the idea into that cosmos, because as soon as it becomes objective, you have to leave the ideas behind. You have to leave the visualization behind. When you look at atomic particle physics in the 20th century, they always say that the first particle found was the electron, and they cite it as J.J. Thomson, 1897, exactly 100 years ago. But if you look at J.J. Thomson's book of 1907, 10 years later, it's not about electrons. It's called The Corpuscular Theory of Matter, because he still didn't get it. And he's the world's greatest physicist at the time. He still didn't get it, even 10 years after supposedly he had discovered the electron, the first subatomic particle. The first time that you find the electron, this is a duplicate copy thrown away from the Niels Bohr Library, American Institute of Physics. I happened to be there to buy it. The Electron in Chemistry, 1923. Lectures given at the Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Because Bohr was conscious. Believe me, he was very conscious. So he went to talk about the electron in chemistry to one of the places in the world that one consciously could honor a forerunner. Benjamin Franklin's very much a forerunner. He's the one who developed electricity understanding scientifically enough to leave off at the verge of where the electron was there. And it's true, it took a long time. It took over 100 years to make that jump. But the jump from Benjamin Franklin's electricity and his understanding to J.J. Thomson's understanding of the electron by 1923, that step was too big to take, even though it was only one step. It needed a boost, and the boost came from a man in England who worked on a particle which was called the proton. His name was Rutherford, Ernst Rutherford. It took him 8 years, from 1911 to 1919. It took him all that time to come to the understanding that there was a positive charged particle called the proton, because in this first publication on the electron, one already has a scientific exactness. J.J. Thomson, good enough as a physicist to compute that the electron was 1/1700th the mass of the proton. The proton being, for all intents and purposes, a hydrogen atom minus the infinitesimally small fraction, the particle of the electron, which was the negative charge. By 1923, by late 1923, it was apparent that one can take a conscious fractal of the objective universe and deal with it as a reality and come out with mathematically measurable, experimentally doable confirmations. A scientific experimental confirmation is taking the idea which has gone through the whole conscious ecology up to science and running it back through nature, giving that over to nature, so that the first scientific instrument to fraction atoms was not a bevitron, not a cyclotron, but was the action of cosmic rays in the atmosphere. Because cosmic rays are powerful enough to fracture atoms and to release particles. not only the electron, but within a short period of time, by the 1930s, it was apparent that there were particles. And by 1937, a particle had been found that was called at the time to match electron. It was called mesotron. Later on, we get a whole family of particles called mesons. But the mesotrons originally were not in what is now the family of mesons, but they were in a family, they were called leptons. And the discovery in the 1930s was very, very peculiar. The electron now is called the number one lepton, but in the 1930s was discovered three other particles that were originally grouped under one, the mesotron. And as they came to understand it, they found that it split in such a way that you had a very odd pairing. Two of the three particles are characterized now as the muon and the anti-muon. These are names that are given later to it. The third particle had its pair with the electron, and it was called the positron. So that by 1937, it was apparent that there were at least a pair of pairs of particles. And from then on, it was like a wonderland, because the more that man consciously did this process, turning the science over to nature and cycled it through, the more that at each cycle the intelligence rose, the capacity to see accumulated, the ability to envision became sharper, the ideas became more profound. By the end of the 1930s, there was a great glitch that developed, and we'll talk about that next week. The great glitch was the atomic bomb. Two realities stuck in the throat of the largely small population, there were about 30 of them in the world at the time, of men who understood what we were on the verge of. The first reality was that the splitting of the atom, nuclear fission, once conceived in the mind of someone, was going to be inevitable in the manifestation in the world. And that the only choice before them was that this kind of power should be with human beings who valued democracy and human life. Not the Nazis, but what was called the Allies, the West at the time. The second difficulty was that along with this inevitability was that one was going to have an application on an engineering level, on an industrial level. So you had two kinds of science that came out at the end of the 1930s, at the beginning of the Second World War, that was a nightmare of choices for the handful of people who understood it at the time. The nightmare was one that they had to dream, and they didn't know how it was going to turn out. As long as just a handful of differentially conscious, talented individuals were handling nuclear energy, you could keep it within the range of people who understood that you had to deal with the wholeness of the implicate order. But as soon as you had the process, and you turned it over to engineering political institutions that didn't have this consciousness, they were going to be able to not just have an atom bomb, but tens of thousands of atom bombs and technological methods of delivering them on other people. There were two persons in the world who understood this to the nth degree. One was Niels Bohr and the other was Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer chose the courageous path of running this back through the whole process and hoping that the industrial application could be infused by the genius of the few. Bohr took a parallel action in running it back through, but with the emphasis on keeping the purity of the consciousness among the few who could understand it. By the late 20th century, we now recognize what kind of incredible superhuman courage that Bohr and Oppenheimer had. The crunch came not only with the atom bomb. They only made a couple of atom bombs during the Second World War. There was a great film made of it with Paul Newman, Little Man and Fat Boy. The crunch and the second wave was the worst because it came after the Second World War was over, when all the industrial powers and the governments of the world had atomic energy, and they knew that they could not only make weapons of mass destruction, but they could put them on an assembly line. This came to a crunch in 1947 at a conference held not far from Montauk Point on the end of Long Island, an island called Shelter Island. And it was there, that conference of Shelter Island in early 1947, that the whole future of the 20th century was made. And we'll talk about that next week. It involves Feynman. And it's interesting to note that at the same time the Shelter Island Conference was being held at the end of Long Island, way over in Africa, there was a Pan-African Congress held by the Leakeys for the very same purpose, but in paleontological dimensions, not nuclear physics. They both happened at the same time. Characteristically enough, Mother Nature, never missing a beat to be dramatic, allowed man to break the sound barrier in 1947 on October 14th. I remember the day well. I was 7 years old, and I can remember the news reports that man had not only broken the sound barrier, but had destroyed the myth of there being some kind of brick in the sky at the speed of sound. The myth is that sound is so strong at the threshold of its speed that it would be like a brick wall, and that jet pilots would hit that as if they would hit a brick wall. When Chuck Yeager came back from breaking it, he said instead of a wall, he found a hole in the air. And he said, that's what was there. He said, I saw it. And every jet pilot since then, getting above Mach 1, knows the sight of that whirlpool hole in the air that's much more difficult to deal with than a brick wall, because it's an invitation, it's a funnel to indefinite transformation. The challenge is not just to transform, but to have the courage of heart to accept that transformations are infinite. More next week.